Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and before I start this episode here today, I just wanted to give you a quick appeal. There are a number of you that have requested that I continue to do Sony-related reviews in the future. As I've explained in person to some of you, I'm in the middle of having our first home built, and so all of my available funds are channeled into that right now. And so it's not really an option for me to add any other camera bodies to my kit, and much less a quite expensive Sony a7R II. However, some of you suggested that I create a crowdfunding opportunity to help to purchase one, and so I can do Sony reviews for you in the future. So I'm giving you a chance to put your money where your mouth is. And so if you would like to see that happen, I have a GoFundMe.com, Dustin Abbott A7R2. I've set a goal of $3,000, and I'll purchase the Sony body, and we'll continue to do some Sony reviews moving ahead. And so if that's something you'd like to see happen, you have a chance to contribute towards that. If not, sit back, enjoy the episode, have a great day. Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today not to really do a thorough review of the Sony a7R II, but just to give you some of my thoughts. As most of you know, I am a longtime Canon shooter, and so that's where my experience is. And I do want to say thanks to B&H Photo. I needed to do a review on a Zeiss lens that only comes in a Sony E-mount, and so I didn't have a Sony body, and B&H Photo was nice enough to loan me this a7R II. I also got the 28-70 FE lens to come in, and just so I'd have a chance to familiarize myself a bit with the camera before I started to use it. I've also used the Metabones 4 adapter here, and so I can use some of my existing glass. And so anyway, I've had a fun time with the camera, and I'm here today just to give you some kind of feedback of just kind of real world use of the camera, strengths and weaknesses. First of all, I will say that although this is a nicely built camera, ergonomically, I don't really enjoy it very much. And one of those reasons is right here. You see, the grip is just not long enough, and the way that it hits, it feels like this pinky finger is just kind of stranded underneath. And so as a result, the grip doesn't fit my hand even as well as some of the other small mirrorless bodies that I've used. And so I don't enjoy it in that sense, at least with the size of my hands. A few other ergonomic things, even the actual lens release button is down here. Of course, I'm used to it on Canons it being here, and so I find that many times when I'm going to change out a lens, I don't naturally go to that position. I find that release button a little bit hard to find, and so that's not a favorite thing either. In terms of the overall ergonomics of the controls, once again, one thing I will say, it does have, as a plus, it has the ability to tweak just about everything in terms of the dials and the controls and how they function. And so I did have to spend some time going through the menus and setting things up in a way that kind of mentally worked for me, because out of the box I found it really frustrating. So I was able to improve that overall. Still, I've not necessarily found what I would consider a naturally intuitive workflow. I really feel like it would benefit from a good touchscreen, particularly for changing focus points. Canon's, kind of touch and grab autofocus with using the LCD screen it's a huge benefit there. And so I think that the Sony a7R series could really benefit from a great touchscreen. So I'm hoping that future models do have that, because beyond some of the criticisms there is a lot to love about it. I mean, in terms of the overall image quality, it really is awesome. It's awesome to have a mirrorless body that has such high resolution, and packed into that 42 megapixel sensor. There's a lot of detail. It does quite good in low light. It has a good dynamic range to it. In terms of the sensor is awesome that's in here, and really is rivals just about anything else out there overall. And so that certainly is a great strength. I also have really appreciated the there I go trying to release a lens. I've also really appreciated the built-in 5-axis image stabilization, and it works really well. And so as a result, some lenses that I've never had image stabilization for before, including some of my vintage glass, throw them onto an adapter and use them. And what a joy it is to have, number one, to have image stabilization, and that is an asset there. But for example, I've got the Voigtlander Ultron 40mm f2 lens. I find that lenses like this kind of sing in this application because once you get it set up, you can easily magnify the image in the viewfinder and quickly autofocus and know that you're nailing focus absolutely because it's magnified there in the image, and then when you go to actually push the shutter, the image will come back out, and so that you can recompose or compose properly. But between that and then manual focus aids like zebras, which you can enable enable focus peaking, various manual focus aids, which, frankly, I don't mess with those so much for the way I'm shooting as far as stills. Those are more helpful for me shooting video. For shooting stills, just being able to magnify that image in the viewfinder is huge. And so it's really allowed me to get some of the best results that I've ever gotten from many of my manual focus glass and kind of vintage lenses. And so I really appreciate it for that. I appreciate the fact, of course, that Sony from the beginning has pushed for adapters that allow you to use other mounts on the Sony system. I think that has been very smart on their part. And so, overall, mixed results with some of my Canon lenses. And of course, the Metabones 4 adapter. I don't know that there's really a perfect adapter out there yet. A lot of people like Sony's MC11 adapter. Not Sony's, but Sigma's MC11 adapter. And I haven't used that, but I suspect it probably works pretty well, particularly with Sigma lenses. Overall, I find that autofocus typically works, but it's sedate compared to what I'm accustomed to on a good DSLR body. And so autofocus, however, is good. What I do appreciate is that there's a lot of different ways to tweak autofocus behavior. But what I do miss is I've never discovered yet a really what I consider intuitive way to quickly change autofocus points if I'm going to more of a single point. And so that's where I really think that the touchscreen and or just better physical controls would help a lot with that. Now, in terms of the overall sensor performance, how does it compare to my 5D Mark IV? Let's take a moment and pause and just look at some things like high ISO performance and pushing shadows, just to see how it handles those types of things. Okay, what we're going to have here is a comparison as we just kind of rack up through the ISO settings between the Canon 5D Mark IV on the left and then the Sony a7R II on the right. Just to create kind of a static, remove a lens from the equation, we have got the new Sigma 135mm f1.8 art on both bodies here. So here at ISO 1600, neither one of these cameras are breaking a sweat. I have input an equal white balance here, but as you can see, they both render in a little bit different way. The Canon has added a little bit extra exposure, which you can see 1/50th versus 1/60th. So if we look at our subjects here, now on the right side, which is going to be the Sony, you're going to see in this series that there's a difference in magnification. Reason being, of course, is that the Sony has 12 megapixels more of size resolution than the Canon, and so it just creates at a pixel level, it creates a larger image. So as we can see, comparing both these side by side, lots of detail. However, I would say at ISO 1600, that greater resolution on the Sony is allowing it to have just a little bit more contrast and resolution overall, I would see. In terms of the general noise pattern, there's minimal noise for either one, just a very fine grain, and really not a whole lot to distinguish here. At ISO 3200, the story is still the same. This is still easy going for both of these cameras, and so I'm not seeing any kind of discoloration enter into the equation here. And as far as the basic noise pattern, it's still, it's maybe slightly, just the tiniest bit more noticeable for both of them, but, it's still rendering a very smooth output here. And so no problems there. If we look down here in the shadows, I'm not really seeing a lot of noise being created in the shadows from either one of these bodies. All right, jumping up another stop to ISO 6400, we see here that we're just starting to see a little bit more actual noise or grain pattern here in the overall textures on our subjects themselves. And I would say that at this stage I'm seeing a little bit heavier in the Sony as compared to the Canon. But remember too, the Sony has a bit of a disadvantage in that it's delivering much more pixels here, and so overall this is still a great performance by both cameras. And looking up here, we can see that there's definitely some noise showing up on both of them now. However, I don't see any kind of color banding on either one. Grain pattern just a little bit more intense on the Sony. If we jump down here into the shadow portion here, I would say that you know, the Sony's still doing a great job. If anything, there's maybe just a hint more noise in the shadow for the Canon body. However, I do think that the overall textures contrast here maybe favors the Canon a little bit at ISO 6400. Alright, so now at ISO 12800, this is really where we're starting to enter into a more serious challenge for modern bodies. And we can see looking here that while we still have a very detailed, clean result from them both, there is a little bit more noise that's apparent just in the basic textures here. And I would say that the noise pattern is more obvious overall in the Sony, and once again, you know, it's a little bit more magnified by that extra bit of resolution, but I would say that overall the Canon is looking a little bit better here, and the grain pattern is a little heavier on the Sony body overall. However, again, looking globally at the image, I'm not really seeing any kind of actual color banding from either one of these. If we look into the shadow information here, both of them still are pretty clean in this shadow portion here. Okay, now at if we're looking at ISO 25600, and basically what we saw at ISO 12800 is just a little bit more exaggerated here. However, I would say overall the loss is not terrible in these at this step here. And so overall here, I would say that it looks like light transmission is very slightly favoring the Canon, but remember that we're working with a native Canon mount as opposed to an adapter here on the Sony, which could impact that, so don't read too much into it. As far as looking at the overall noise pattern, it's definitely heavier on the Sony, and that increased resolution just makes that noise pattern a little bit more obvious. Again, however, as terms of overall color banding, I don't really see anything terrible here. Let's just look over at this area just for the fun of it, and I would say that there's the faintest bit of magenta in there on the Canon. Overall, I think that the Sony image is starting to acquire a little bit more of a green cast to it. If we look into the shadow information here, definitely a heavier noise pattern on the shadow for the Sony at 25600. Okay, now we're hitting the top end of the native range for the Canon at ISO 32000. The Sony has a little bit more still to go, and we'll take a look at that independent. Here I would say that the Canon is starting to show some color banding in a way that the Sony is still a little bit more confident here. If we look up at the overall noise pattern, I would say that the Canon's noise pattern has now, you know, gotten pretty close to equaling that of the Sony overall. It's a little bit rougher here, and looking over in this area, there's just a little bit more of that kind of magenta coloration. Down in the shadow area, I'm starting to see a little bit of a magenta cast starting to come in, whereas the Sony is just showing a little bit more kind of just blackness by comparison. Now what's interesting here is if I reduce the size of the Sony image still at ISO 32000 to the same resolution as that of the Canon body, we see even more notable advantage for the Sony in terms of just overall detail and clarity. You see how that a lot of the contrast and detail has been lost in this area, whereas the Sony is showing it. Then if we look up into the kind of just noise pattern, you'll see that at the same resolution, the Sony noise pattern is a little bit less defined, and I would say it looks a little bit smoother overall. And once again, if we look down into the shadow information, at similar resolution, we can see that the Sony is definitely looking better there in the shadow portion of the image. So here's the Sony at ISO 51200, and so if we look here, we see that really overall I don't think that it's lost a whole lot. The noise pattern is getting more pronounced here, I would say, but I still see a lot of detail being rendered there, and overall, globally, I would consider the image to still be quite useful, depending on your application. Now, there's yet one more setting here. If we jump up to the 102,400 setting, if you just toggle back and forth, here's at the 51,000 and the 102,000, you can see that you have a pretty serious loss. That's where it really is coming in. And so I would say using up to the 51,000 setting is useful. Jumping up to the 102,000 setting is just going to introduce some color banding and more noise than what I think is worth it. We're just going to take a look at what happens when you push the shadows. And so here I've underexposed by 2 stops. This is on the Sony body, and then here I've added back 2 stops of exposure. And so if we take a look at this, we can see that pushing the shadows at ISO 6400 shows that we're introducing a pretty fair amount of noise, although the image is still useful here. I would say that we're introducing a fair bit of noise. The biggest thing I think I see with the Sony is that pushing that does produce a pretty strong color cast here. Now, if we do the same thing with the Canon, now this is actually a little bit more of a push because the underexposing, it ended up in a 1/6400th as opposed to the Sony exposed a little more at 1/500th. But if we look here towards the center of the frame, we can see that the Canon push, I would say, is a little bit smoother in the result that it has produced, and there's a little bit less of that color cast that has been introduced into the image. So if we compare the 2-stop push here, we can see that there's definitely a difference in the overall color balance here, and this is with both images having set a white balance in, and so I think the Canon handles that a little bit better, but let's push it a little bit harder. Okay, so now we have a 4-stop push, and so this image is underexposed here by 4 stops, and if we look here, you know, that's a pretty ugly looking result, having pushed it 4 stops in terms of the amount of noise. Now, I mean, there's still, obviously there's detail there, but the image overall looks pretty bad, and more importantly here, I'm also seeing that we've introduced some color fringing and banding in here, and then also that overall color cast that I'm not crazy about. Now, if we push the Canon image on the exact same setting, those 4 stops, here I'm not any more encouraged by the Canon result. You know, detail looks fine, but lots of noise and definitely a lot of color cast there, kind of more towards the magenta end than the greenish end like the Sony, but neither one of these at ISO 6400 would I recommend pushing that hard. So as you can see, the A7R II, it certainly gives up nothing compared to the 5D Mark IV when it comes to high ISO performance and pushing shadows. The one thing I think that Canon may do a little bit better is that I think that at higher ISO settings or in pushed images, I think that the color accuracy remains a little bit better overall, but in terms of the actual noise and patterns, I think that the A7R II is just as good, if not better. So as I've said, this is a great sensor and a lot of great technology. What the A7R II needs is a little bit better packaging in terms of the ergonomics, the controls, and I think if Sony ever figures all of that out, I think they're going to have a serious winner on their hands. So there's been enough here to whet my appetite that I will be very carefully watching when the next generation of this camera comes out with serious consideration for potentially adding one to my own kit. I'm Dustin Abbott, and yes, this is going to be going back to B&H Photo actually this week, but I've enjoyed my time with it in a number of ways. And of course, I haven't even really detailed into it because I haven't used it a lot for that purpose. But of course, video quality is quite exceptional here, and a lot of different modes, a lot of goodness to choose from there. A great platform if you are looking for a relatively inexpensive way to get high-end video. If you look in the description down below, you can find some linkage to image gallery and a few further thoughts, some links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. If you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.